Okay. On a slightly different topic now. Anyone seen the latest Game of Thrones episode? I wasn't talking to you, PJ. Anyone seen the latest Game of Thrones episodes? Season 4, of course, has been out for a little while now. Past 2 episodes, of course, the next one should be, I think, next Sunday. Of course, I'll have to have it taped, although I'll probably end up seeing it on HBO Go. It's just really handy that way. Really interesting episode because you've already had King Joffrey die. The last one, already had King Joffrey die, which, frankly, at this point, I was rooting for him to die a lot sooner, but he didn't. Let's just say the character was not a very likable character. Who actually killed him? Guess we'll have to find out. I haven't read that far into the books yet. I'm still in book 2, but I'm already in season 4. So I'm catching up, trying to catch up with the books versus the series, Game of Thrones. Book 2, of course, is Clash of Kings. Getting pretty far along in that. Already know what's going to happen, but still I'm reading it. You get a lot of details in the books that you don't get in the TV series. And of course, there are characters that they change radically. Let's see, Game of Thrones, what else is there? I used to watch Rome. That was an interesting series. One of those shows that was really fascinating. So, there's a lot of programs that I find interesting that I like to discuss. Programs that have subject matter that are more appealing to one more like history buff or into the Middle Ages or classical history. Things of that nature. Ancient Rome. That kind of thing. Of course, in Game of Thrones, it's not actual history. It's a fantasy world. It's one created by George R. Martin. It's grittier, it's darker, but it's a very captivating story. Tale there. Involving a lot of the very common themes in literature, but there's certainly some twists. You have the young king, but the young king is evil. The young king is twisted, messed up. That, of course, is Joffrey. One presumes his somewhat younger brother Tommen will be at least a little bit more likable, but he's also a kid. He's even younger than Joffrey. So what exactly that's going to mean, it'll be interesting to find out. Tyrion, of course, has now been arrested for the suspected murder of Joffrey. Joffrey is definitely dead, but presumably Tyrion didn't do the deed.
King Joffrey?
King Joffrey, yes, PJ.
Boy?
He was a teenager, but yeah. The younger brother is the real young brother. Boy. Tobbit. Of course, as anyone knows the actual backstory, Joffrey, Tommen, and their sister Myrcella are not actually the rightful heirs. They are the result of a secret relationship between the Queen Cersei and, revolting as this concept may be, her brother Jaime. And of course, this is something concealed. PJ, leave the commentary out. This is something concealed from her husband Robert. And she killed him earlier than she planned, presumably to protect that secret. PJ, just let me speak. Anyway, And of course, she had to have Ned Stark removed because he knew too much. And she had to have Jon Arryn removed because he knew too much. They knew too much of what was going on. You know, that Robert Baratheon was not the father of the so-called Baratheon children, the princes. Starting with Joffrey and going down through Myrcella and then the youngest, Tommen. Of course, Ned Stark, just like Jon Arryn, they both stumble into the secret. And there are a lot of characters who have various reasons for not wanting this to become revealed, but of course it does get revealed to a certain extent, although not everyone accepts it, by Stannis Baratheon, who is the brother of Robert Baratheon, or one of the brothers of Robert Baratheon, and he asserts that these are not the proper children of Robert Baratheon. They're not actually his children. They're not their actual heirs, and he asserts it in such a way as to make it clear that he's claiming the throne. He is claiming the throne as the heir to the throne, as the next oldest, and by the accepted law of the time, that is true. He's the heir. I mean, if as in the story, it makes it pretty clear, these are in fact not Robert's children, then Stannis is, legally speaking, the heir to the throne, the rightful heir, at least if you're going by the Baratheon dynasty. And of course, it is his younger brother, Renly, but Renly does not survive. He falls prey to an incident that some people blame on Ned Stark's widow, Catelyn. Others blame on his bodyguard, Renly's bodyguard, Brienne of Tarth, who was, I believe, the only female member of the bodyguard, the so-called Rainbow Guard. And of course, you have the situation where Sansa Stark is cast aside as the bride of Joffrey in favor of Margaery Tyrell, because Margaery, of course, has been widowed, and she's been married off promptly to Joffrey. Now we got to find out where this will leave. Margaery, now that Joffrey is dead. She's had two husbands now now, and one of them at his wedding, no less. That's Joffrey. So he barely gets married to her, and he's dead. He drinks a poisoned cup, and he falls dead. And that, of course, is where Tyrion is blamed. Cersei accuses him and then tells the guards to take him. That was the end of the last episode. So we got that situation. We got a lot of intrigue going on, a lot of court politics. It's a fascinating thing because you're dealing with this fairly realistic scenario that happened in a lot of royal courts at the time. Same time frame, except for in real Europe. A lot of these same kinds of scenarios. But of course, this is set in a fictional world, the Kingdom of Westeros, the Seven Kingdoms. You have to admire the brilliance of George R.R. Martin in creating a world just from his own imagination that does not exist in reality. A world of basically a medieval kingdom. And then there's kingdoms all around it, territories all around it, the free cities and so forth. These characters vying for the throne, the War of the Five Kings. You had Joffrey, of course, Renly, Stannis, Robb Stark, the son of Ned Stark, the oldest son, and Daenerys Targaryen. Daenerys Targaryen, of course, is more often the off-screen, more peripheral to the whole situation for now. But, it's eventually going to become, pretty clear an issue because she is growing up, she's getting older, she has the dragons. They call her the mother of dragons. She has the pet dragons that they're growing up. Nobody actually thought when they gave her the dragon eggs that these would have real dragons in them. They thought they were long since dead, basically. Dead eggs, as it were. So you got a situation where they emerge as little dragons and they start to grow, and now people are realizing, okay, when these dragons are fully grown, they could do some damage. But anyway, you got to actually her raising an army. It takes a while, but she's managed to overcome several obstacles. She's got a considerable following now. She's the last of the Targaryens, leaving aside Aemon Targaryen, who is a member of the Night's Watch and has no involvement in the politics and so forth. I mean, if he'd wanted the throne, he could have taken it long before, which is a fascinating thing right there. But, of course, she was the younger sister of Viserys Targaryen, who was trying to use her as a means of getting the throne for himself. And, of course, he made a deal with Khal Drogo of the Dothraki. The Dothraki are a race of basically riders, raiders, and so forth, who are very skeptical of the idea of going across the sea. You know, they're fine with traveling over the open plain with their horses. Everything is about, you know, the mentality of riding on a horse. Your masculinity is all connected to being a rider of a horse and so forth. So it's a very different world, and she's been kind of, in some ways, affected and assimilated by that. Her brother, of course, gets killed by the Khal, basically the king of the Dothraki, Khal Drogo. Basically killed essentially by his own brother-in-law. More or less for making demands that you don't make of a Dothraki Khal. They just don't like that kind of stuff. You don't make demands of them. So it's a very different, I think it's a very different kind of series so far. It's very fascinating. Anyone who has not gotten into it hasn't had it spoiled too much for them by me. I would recommend that. It's a highly, good night, PJ. It's a highly worthwhile series to get into. Let me see. On another subject, since we're talking about Middle Ages and so forth, of course, there's a lot of parallels to the Wars of the Roses. Anyone knows anything about the Wars of the Roses? I'm not talking about the the movie about the divorce settlement thing with the house and all that. No, I'm talking about the Wars of the Roses. I'm talking about the historical period of time in which you had the two major English houses, Lancaster and York. The House of Lancaster and the House of York. This basically starts with a revolt by Edward, Duke of York, who was trying... No, not Edward. Richard, Duke of York, who was trying to control the then king, the member of the House of Lancaster, the King Henry VI, who was kind of feeble-minded fellow. Very religious, very pious guy, but very weak and very feeble-minded and prone to insanity. One theme you might notice some history from the... it's a reality thing here, yes, but history does have a certain theme to it, the way it's chronicled and so forth, things that come across. And one of the things is, of course, the Lancastrians are very pious people. You had, like I said, Henry IV, Henry VI, Henry V, and so forth. That comes across with them. Their involvement with the Lollards and so forth. John of Gaunt was much the same way. John of Gaunt was, of course, Henry Bolingbroke's father. John of Gaunt was one of the sons of Edward III. Edward III had several children, of course. One of them, like I said, was John of Gaunt, and his son was, of course, Henry Bolingbroke. So basically, you had a situation where Richard II, it really starts fundamentally with Richard II. Richard II was the grandson, the immediate successor of Edward III, because Richard's father, Edward the Black Prince, died a year before he would have succeeded as father. He died in 1376. Of course, anyone who knows anything about history about the Black Prince knows that he died of dysentery. He was a very famous soldier, was a very famous fighter. He had captured the King of France and held him for ransom as a hostage for a while. at the Battle of Poitiers. He captured at the Battle of Poitiers. So he was well on his way to becoming a very famous king in and of his own right. And who knows what exact effect would have had Edward the Black Prince, in fact, succeeded his father. Instead, he dies, and his own 10-year-old or 9 or 10-year-old son, Richard, becomes Richard II, succeeding his grandfather, Edward III. And then, of course, you get in the situation where you have these cousins quarreling. You have the very arrogant, very presumptuous, perhaps a bit well-meaning, but certainly haughty figure of Richard II, who did not want any kind, bless you, did not want any kind of, defiance of him. He became increasingly a tyrant, especially after his wife Anna Bohemia perished, after she died. He starts getting really dark areas here, And of course that leads to the revolt. 1399 leads to Henry IV replacing him, Henry Bolingbroke becoming Henry IV. Parliament, in a precedent-setting act, the first time that really ever, actually not the first time, the second time we've ever done this, set aside his kingship. The first time he'd done that, Edward II, which replaced him in favor of Edward III. This time it replaced Richard II in favor of Henry IV. So you do have a precedent being set for Parliament removing a king. Significant. Because this gives Parliament quite a bit of power, especially in that time. And by Parliament, essentially, in those days, it's fundamentally the nobles and the clergy, although you do have the commons represented to a certain extent. But you do have basically the barons of the realm and the clergy, and some representatives of the lower orders, seated in Parliament, and they're deciding, okay, we're done with Richard II. We've done this before with Edward II, getting rid of him in favor of Edward III. Now we're going to put in Henry IV. Of course, you get Henry IV is king for about 14 years. He's having to deal with several rebellions, particularly with Percys and so forth. He's having to put down people who are a threat to his reign, because after all, he is viewed by people still as a usurper. It's a famous line from Shakespeare's Richard II, where he has Richard say, "Not all the water in the rough rude sea can wash the balm from an anointed king. The breath of worldly men cannot depose the deputy elected by the Lord." This is a very important principle, and it's being presented in opposition to parliamentary prerogatives, parliamentary precedents, and so forth. It's the idea of the divine right of kings, and of course that surfaces again later. It never completely dies for a long period of time in English history. It takes a long time for that idea to die. It keeps coming back like a vampire in a way, or a zombie, or what you want to call it, to use the analogy. It keeps wanting to come back, So we get, anyway, Henry IV. He reigns for 14 years. His son is Henry V, and he gets a 9-year reign, and it's cut down in his prime. But he, of course, wins 2 years into his reign. He wins the famous Battle of Agincourt, 1415. A staggeringly outnumbered English army, heavily composed of footmen, archers, and so forth, who just decimated, absolutely devastated the French knights that came after them, assaulted them. This is one of those situations, classic situations, where you have the English longbowman. And the English longbow was a terrific piece of weaponry here. It was just absolutely stunning, the effects that it could have. It's a lethal piece of weaponry for its time. It was a real, breakthrough. And the English longbow just absolutely had a devastating impact on the French cavalry and French knights. Of course, they'd done it before. That's the funny thing. I mean, it's not like they hadn't done this kind of stuff before. They won at Crécy, they won at Poitiers, they won several key battles with Edward the Black Prince, with Edward III himself, against the same kind of French army, which was a classic medieval equestrian force, chivalric force, knights, and so forth. Heavy horse, heavy cavalry. And so, of course, that is defeated, that is decimated by the English archers. So you got that situation there, and then of course we're getting closer back on track. You get Henry the Sixth, who's a child. Right about this time, Joan of Arc is doing her thing and basically helping the French drive the English out. It helps the French cause the English happen to be dealing with a young king. They have a regent and so forth. A young king which has French blood in his veins, I might add, though, because his mother is Catherine of Valois. His mother is a French princess. In fact, his uncle is the Dauphin. His rival is his uncle. His maternal uncle, the Dauphin, who later becomes Charles VII. And of course, you got a situation where he's crowned at Reims, the traditional crowning place. Apparently, the English aren't really that familiar with this, or they didn't have too many choices, because in 1431, their coronation of Henry as King of France, which doesn't really fall through because of the defeat they suffer, is done in Paris. So you have that situation where the 100 Years' War starts to wind to a close. It never gets fully resolved, and really until about a century or so later. But it basically is pretty much done. For all practical purposes, that war is pretty much done by 1453, at which point the all that remains of the English possessions in France, the old feudal possessions, is Calais. Calais, of course, is a city now in France, but at the time it was, like I said, an English possession, the last toehold on the continent. It's their base of operations, which Henry VIII later used as a base of operations to try to recover France. It wasn't really lost until actually the reign of Mary Tudor, Mary the First, after she ill-advisedly entered a war on behalf of her husband Philip of Spain against France. But in the process lost Calais. It was an expensive territory, but it was important to their national prestige, and losing it, big deal, big national psychological blow, especially for her reign. But we're not getting into that yet. The Wars of the Roses really start to emerge sometime not long after Jack Cade's rebellion. Jack Cade was a rather interesting character. He's the one that's quoted in Shakespeare as essentially saying, "That's the first thing we do, let's kill all lawyers." He was wanting to establish what was really an early form of communism, which is shocking. But, at that time, I guess, desperate times, desperate measures, he was advocating something along those lines. So Jack Cade gets put down. He has a rebellion. It doesn't last. But sometime after that, you get a situation where you have the feeble-minded King Henry VI being dominated heavily by the influence of his wife, Margaret of Anjou. And of course, the Angevin or Anjou dynasty or territory has long been closely connected to England anyway. So that's basically a cousin of his. A French princess, a cousin, and so forth, who's Queen of England at the time. But there's a battle for influence over Henry between Margaret of Anjou and Richard, Duke of York. And this is what prompts the Wars of the Roses. Eventually, you have a situation where Richard is killed. He has support from Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick. By this time, he's bringing his support to his son Edward, who then claims the throne. He claims the throne himself and becomes king in 1461, deposing Henry VI. Reigns for 9 years. Of course, by that point, he turns against his turns against his friend Richard Neville, and crosses him because there's an attempt by Neville to the Earl of Warwick to get him to marry a French princess named Bonar. Unusual name, but that was apparently less unusual at the time or something. But he wanted to marry someone else. He wanted to marry Elizabeth Woodville. And she becomes Queen Elizabeth and mother to the future Edward V, the future Richard, Duke of York, and of course Elizabeth of York, who will become important later on. In a situation where Edward crosses Richard Neville, is briefly deposed in favor of Henry VI again, then is restored to power the next year, 1471, a very short restoration for Henry VI. Defeats, if I remember correctly, kills Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, and it resumes the throne for another 12 years. So you have the ascendancy of the House of York. They seem to be in charge. They seem to have everything together. It's a much longer period of time than is presented in movies about Richard III and so forth, which are based heavily off the Shakespearean version. But anyway, so you got a situation where there's three brothers. You got Richard, Duke of Gloucester, George, Duke of Clarence, and of course King Edward IV. At some point, there's a dispute between Edward IV and his brother George, the Duke of Clarence, and George, the Duke of Clarence, is eliminated from the picture, so they say, to put it nicely. So yet George is out of the picture, and then you have the death of Edward IV. Edward IV dies. You have, in 1483, you have very briefly the reign of Edward V. He doesn't really do very much. He's has the Lord Protector, Richard of Gloucester, pretty much running things. And then, at some point, not sure when, what the circumstance were, why, it's kind of a murky period of English history, but once again, Parliament sets aside a monarch in favor of another monarch. You have this precedent being followed again. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, the Lord Protector of England, becomes king in his own right. And so doing, he reigns for 2 years. But he also alienates Elizabeth Woodville, the Dowager Queen, who, along with her daughter, turned for help to Henry Tudor, the Earl of Richmond, who was the last, albeit cadet branch, albeit the leader of a cadet branch, last of the Lancastrians. So, and he's related through Margaret Beaufort, of course. So he's the last of the Lancastrians, and he defeats and kills Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth Field. I should note, by the way, that Richard III has been vilified heavily by history. Some people believe that he had a hand in his nephew's death. But this is the man who came up with the concept of bail, or somebody is bailed out. This is the man under whose reign, under whose authority, the notion of bail was introduced. Well, this is significant for English law. So even from a 2-year reign of a man who's been vilified in history as a tyrant, a murderer, and so forth, you have something this significant introduced in English law. And of course that's passed down to the generations. Obviously there was something useful enough about Henry VII to get rid of it when he defeated Richard III. Of course, there you get the end of the Wars of the Roses with Battle of Bosworth Field. There's the famous legend of the crown and the thicket, supposedly being picked up and then put on the head of Henry VII and he becomes king in 1485 that way. That's probably more apocryphal than it is historical. But in any case, you have a 24-year reign, a very stable, for the most part, leaving aside incidents like Perkin Warbeck's rebellion, the Cornish rebellion, and so forth. Leaving aside those little incidents, fairly stable reign. He's basically able, sometimes through duplicitous and underhanded means, grant you, he was able to restabilize the finances of the kingdom, put it on a more centralized, sometimes, let's say too centralized, let's say despotic basis. But he gets the country on a sound footing. You're really starting to see the English middle class emerging. You're seeing the decline, even the decimation of the old great lords, because a lot of them were killed off in the Wars of the Roses. You get a lot of new favorites being created and so forth, being given titles and so forth. And this continues under Henry V. In fact, one of the big complaints of one of the few remaining great houses, the Howards, has to do with precisely this. The royal favorites, the nobles of the robe, as it were, being given this power, given these titles and so forth, as opposed to the nobles of the sword. So you have that, you're leading now into the period of the Tudors. But anyway, that's, to me, a very fascinating period of history. I mean, connected closely in the same kind of, themes as the Game of Thrones. You see a lot of overlapping themes. You see a lot of this kind of wars of succession stuff. And, it's an interesting point that some people make. I think it was Renly makes the point that really not even Stannis has a true claim. I mean, they all have claims that start somewhere. And the claims before that claim was put into effect, there was another one. You had the kings of the First Men, the kings of the Andals. You had the Targaryens. So the Targaryens have a claim. Daenerys Targaryen and so forth, who believes herself the rightful heir. Believes this is rightfully her thing, and of course that means that she considers everyone else a usurper, including Stannis Baratheon. You have Robb Stark, who basically takes the position of, hey, we don't want any part of Westeros anymore. We want our own kingdom. Before the Targaryens came along, we were our own kingdom. Why shouldn't we rule ourselves? So he's more of a separatist kind of king. Of course, you got Stannis Baratheon, who's asserting, hey, okay, like it or not, the Baratheon line is here, and I'm the rightful head of the Baratheon house. This is this. This is the way it is. Of course, you get the Lannister, Joffrey, and so forth. That side of things, claiming the throne for Joffrey Baratheon. Freudian slip there, I guess. Lannister, because he's basically really a Lannister. If you look at him and tell he's a Lannister. Got the blonde hair and so forth, not the dark hair of Robert Baratheon. So you got the War of the Five Kings. You got Renly, Stannis, Daenerys, was the queen, but it's one of the five. Robb, and of course Joffrey. But the same basic theme. You got that rivalry. You have that war of succession. You have that claim to the throne, a sense that this is my birthright. Was it Joffrey says to his mother, it's not a claim. I am the king. And he really believes it. He does not realize that he's been kind of set up and put in this position by underhanded means. He does not realize, of course, the origins. They were not going to tell him. So as far as he knows, he is the king. He honestly believes this is his throne. And he's incensed by the suggestion that he's not the rightful heir. His uncle saying that, no, I'm the rightful heir, and you're not really even my nephew. So you have that whole thing of people who honestly believe this is the right thing. Renly even believes, okay, yeah, I don't have the blood quite the same way, but I'm of the same bloodline and almost as good as Stannis, and I'm better for the kingdom. He's basically making a utilitarian point, which is rather interesting, an argument. Of course, one of the most fascinating things is Lord Varys. Lord Varys is basically taking the position that, yeah, Stannis is the rightful heir. Grant you that. he recognizes Stannis as the rightful heir. But then he turns around and says that this would be a disaster for Westeros. He could think of nothing worse because of the religious views of Stannis Baratheon. His adherence to the Lord of Light, the religion of the Lord of Light. If you know anything about that world, that background, it's a Manichean type religion. It's a dualistic religion. You have the light and the darkness. It's absolute light, absolute darkness against each other. There's absolutely no middle ground. You either serve the Lord of Light or you're serving false gods or the darkness and so forth. Their Red Priestess is, of course, famous for saying, her name is Melisandre, she's famous for saying, the night is dark, full of terrors. So you got this whole element of Stannis Baratheon taking on a new religion, which in some ways has a lot of overlap with a lot of parallels to Constantine, because Constantine had a claim to the Roman throne. It was not the best claim, but he had a claim. And of course he was one to quickly embrace Christianity. So you have the combination of a claim to the throne plus a new religion, a new faith. And an enthusiastic embrace. I do not take those who think that Constantine was just, it was just a matter of statecraft, because he could have picked any religion for that purpose, anything that might possibly unify the Roman Empire. One does not make one's choices in a vacuum, and the fact of the matter is that Constantine's mother was Helena, and Helena was a Christian. So the old saying, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. In that case, I think it really did apply. Constantine embraced the religion of his mother. When it came down to it, when it came to brass tacks, when it came to survival and victory and what he really believed in, and of course, before he died, he was baptized. When it came to what he really believed, what he really asserted, and so forth, Constantine was a Christian, and as far as his actual worldview, he embraced that. He imposed that. He embraced that, and so forth. So you have the same parallel between Constantine the Great, Constantine, the Roman Emperor, who introduced a new religion, who introduced Christianity to the Roman Empire, and you have Stannis Baratheon, who has the same kind of personality as Constantine in many ways. Very authoritative personality, very serious, very rigid in personality, very serious, and ruthless at times about getting what he thinks is his birthright. You get that same sense of, righteousness or righteous indignation, the same claim and so forth. So that's what you have with Stannis Baratheon, the whole Lord of Light business, the worship of the Lord of Light and so forth. So I think that was a deliberate parallel. I don't think that was accidental. I think I don't know for sure, but it would be interesting to talk to George R. R. Martin about that. But I think that he incorporated that for reasons. He deliberately included many historical parallels. You see a lot of the Dothraki, with the similarity to the Tatars and Huns and so forth. You see the Iron Islands, the Ironborn. They have that motto, "We do not sow," talking about paying the iron rather than the gold price. Basically, they take what they want. They're pirates, similar to the Vikings, the same concept. They have their own religion called the Drowned God, which is interesting. It has a form of baptism, no less. They immerse their followers, which is fascinating. And of course, you have the First Men. They have the same religion as the Children of the Forest. They worship what's called the Old Gods, the gods of the First Men, and so forth. And of course, there's the Seven. The Seven are the prevalent mainstream religion of Westeros. They're believed to be gods, but they're kind of embodiment of one god. They're manifestations of one god. 7 manifestations of one god. The Smith, the Crone, the Father, and so forth. So you get a lot of that concept. Different religions and so forth. And it's significant that the Lord of Light has people burned at the stake. The followers of the Lord of Light have people burned at the stake. So it goes along with the whole fire, the sword of fire, and so forth. So you get that element there in different religions. The old gods versus the seven, versus the drowned god versus the Lord of Light. And you get Varys, who apparently has some sort of ulterior motive, which requires Stannis Baratheon not becoming king. Whatever else he knows he doesn't want Stannis Baratheon on the throne. But he makes a good point. He makes a point to basically, like I said, for him, as far as he can tell, having such a king on the throne, he can think of nothing worse than the Iron Throne. Nothing worse than someone like Stannis Baratheon enthralls, he says, to these powers. These, what he considers to be dark and dangerous, powers or whatever. So, he's basically presenting that argument. What his exact motive is remains to be seen. But that's a fascinating TV series. Like I said, I would recommend it for anyone who's interested in that kind, and the books as well, for anyone who's interested in that kind of thing. Again, like I said, it leads back into history. I'll often tie, fiction with nonfiction, because in many cases are deliberate parallels or bases for nonfiction, for fiction, and so forth. Like I said, I don't think there was an accidental. I think George R. R. Martin knew exactly what he was doing when he put these themes, these similarities there. So, calling his Stannis' god the Lord of Light, that's an allusion really to Mithras. Anyone knows anything about the late period of Roman Empire and all that, the Roman imperial period, Mithraism was a very popular religion. It considered its God to be the Lord of Light, and so forth. It's similar to Zoroastrianism. It's loosely associated, and you have that dualism again: the light versus the darkness. It comes out again in Manichaeism, the notion of the kingdom of the light and the kingdom of the darkness, and so forth. So, yeah, that Manichaean worldview, the dualism, and it comes out heavily in the teaching or the ideas of the Red Priestess, Melisandre. So you have that very fascinating TV program, which I really recommend. But again, it leads us back to actual history. I think anytime a TV series gets people interested in history, even if it does have some fallacies in it, or if it's just fiction in this case, if it gets people interested and curious about history, I think that's a good thing. You get people wanting to study history, wanting to understand it. That's a good thing. Getting them asking questions. And I think that gets people to think about the world which they're living. The world, the fact that the world which we're living is not a world that necessarily had to be the way it is. History is fragile. It could have easily, shattered into, so to speak, different pieces. It could have gone off in a different direction. The world that we live in could have emerged differently. So many different X factors. It's where you get alternate history a lot of times, which I find fascinating, such as this book here. Like I said, The Guns of the South. Another book that I've mentioned before that I highly recommend. I think I've even read from it. By Harry Turtledove, Guns of the South. Highly recommend that book. In any case, what was I going to say? It's been an interesting day, having the day off. Of course, I normally have Thursday off anyway, but it's going to be a weird week because I ended up getting Saturday and Sunday off both as well. I made plans ahead of time, kind of late to change the plans, of course. There were some plans that were made that if I had thought about those or factored those in, I probably would have, requested Friday off instead of Saturday, but Be that as it may, I requested Saturday instead, so I got Saturday off. And of course, this time it's too late to change that. Because you can't change this thing so close. Where I work, you can't change things like that close to the time. They need to be able to schedule people, and if they have a radical change at the last minute, it throws their whole schedule off. And I understand that. That's why they have a 3-week rule. You have 3 weeks ahead of time. You have to request it 3 weeks ahead of time to even have a chance of getting approved. So, there is that. Anyway, I think I've rambled enough for a little while. I'm going to take a break and maybe get back on later in a little bit. We'll see. This is the end of this particular webcast for now. And if I lectured in any way, I apologize that probably comes across, or whatever kind of style you want to consider it. But I think I've imparted some information, whatever the stylistic issues. It doesn't hurt to, understand these things. Understand the world of which we come from, the world that existed before us, the history of the world, the history of America, history of England, history. So much of English history is so much of what America is. America would not be what it is without the English history developing the way that it did. So there's so much of England in America, even now, that's influenced what America is. So it is relevant, to discuss things, particularly related to English history. There's so many different things that are fascinating about that. But anyway, I'm going to let you go for now. We'll talk again in a little bit. We'll see. Whenever that is. Either later tonight or tomorrow. We'll see. Anyway, signing off for now.